My name is Rayne Martin. I'm the Executive Director of Stand for Children, Louisiana. We are an advocacy group that engages parents and teachers and other community members in the process of education reform, getting them engaged in policy and the politics around it. So it's a very fun job, as you can imagine. My job here today is to facilitate a panel talking about pre-K. And as one of my friends likes to refer to it, she actually used to be a pre-K teacher. She would always say the babies. What are we going to do about the babies? So that's what we're here to talk about today. As everybody knows, this is a pretty hot topic now. There's money that's floating around at the federal level around this, and many states are talking about this issue, both in terms of funding and quality. But it is, I feel like, as someone who's been in the education reform space for about 6 or 7 years now, relatively new in talking about in earnest in the reform space. So it's interesting and fun to think about it and talk about it from that level as well. What's not new, of course, is the knowledge about how important this particular topic is. And I'm sure you all are familiar with lots of advantages that pre-K, quality pre-K has. Increased achievement scores, decreased retention rates, decreased SPED, increase high school graduation rates. You might have heard of the 7-to-1 investment, which is for every $1 you invest in pre-K, that's a savings of $7 later on in the system. So there's lots of evidence out there that this is a really important topic and something to do well. What's also kind of interesting, and I just learned this in myself in reading up on some of these materials related to this, is right now there's a study out that actually showcases that in professional families, there are about an average of 11 million words that are shared with kids before the age of 3. In comparison with working class, that's 6 million. And in comparison to lower income families, that's 3 million. So many of you probably, again, have seen that. But it just underscores the importance of what we're going to talk about today, which is really about how do you know if a quality pre-K program exists? What does that actually look like? What are the systems and accountability in place to measure those sorts of things? And how does this issue fit into the bigger picture of things that are getting worked on in education reform? So those are going to be a lot of the themes that you hear about today. I'm excited to say that we're all Southerners up on this table right now. So you're with a hospitable group of people. So make sure your questions are very nice. Two amazing leaders with me today. Who actually, when I look through their bios, represent really a diverse set of expertise. We've got parents, business leader, lawmaker, a teacher, a former teacher, administrator. So there's a lot of collective expertise among the two of them. And just to formally introduce you, we have Senator Conrad Appel, who is the chairman of the Senate Education Committee in Louisiana. Let's give him a hand. That job in itself deserves an applause even before he speaks. And we have Shan Goff, who is the executive director of the Florida Office of Early Learning. Let's give her a hand as well.
Thank you.
And with that, I will start with Shan.
Thank you. Rayne did mention that it's probably, well, for us, it's quite unique that you have 2 southern states. Think about what our educational programs looked like in Florida and in Louisiana 12 to 15 years ago. You would have never had 2 southern states, and certainly not us, on any kind of panel talking about any kind of quality improvement or educational program. So I just think that's amazing. And I see you've kind of stacked the deck with Louisiana here. So probably not anything new to you all, but when you live in the K-12 world, it typically is referred to K-12. And it is just that. The pre-kindergarten and early childhood world is so incredibly unique state by state. And I'm gonna, if I do my job today, I'm gonna give you a little bit of flavor about how it is in Florida, the 4th largest state, the players that we have and the journey that we took, and we are still standing upright and alive to tell the story about the voluntary pre-kindergarten education program. Our VPK, as we call it, originated in 2002 with a citizen-led ballot initiative, which is quite amazing in our state, passed by overwhelming support and guaranteed free, and the constitutional amendment does say high quality, early learning opportunities to every 4-year-old in the state of Florida. So to give you a little backdrop, we have had full-day kindergarten for as long as I can remember, 30 to 40 years funded by the state in the K-12 system. So this was a new opportunity for us in Florida to add on a voluntary pre-K program for the state. One of the things that governance-wise, which is a very big issue for us, is we, like many other states, have a lot of constitutional requirements that govern our K-12 system. The constitutional amendment was very clear that Florida's VPK program was not part of the state's elementary and secondary program. Just by being that clear, we were unfettered from a lot of restraints that we could have never gotten around, no matter how creative we were in Florida, and also got us out of some other federal issues between programs for children with disabilities, Title I. Not that any of that is bad in any way, but that was just an overreach that we clearly did not want to have in the state of Florida back in 2002. The other piece is, when you think about early childhood, think about where kids are. They're typically in home, they're with a relative, or most often in a faith-based church preschool program or a private preschool program. In most states, you're only sitting in a public school if I'm a child with disability on or before my 3rd birthday. I mean, that's typically it. So when we embarked upon this, people way smarter than me, including Governor Bush, understood that we were really stepping into a private sector industry and business. Hence, that's where the similarities with K-12 completely end, because you are messing with the private sector, you are messing with someone's business plan, this is their business model, and other than a very small population, these 4-year-olds were someplace else and not in the public sector. It was very important for us in many initiatives in the Bush years. We did a lot of public-private partnerships. It was very important to kind of break the mold, figure out how we were going to do this and make it make sense, not only for Florida's economy, for families, meet the constitutional requirements, but also give parents option that you would not be surprised is a huge issue. So one of the things that, oops, no, I went too far. I don't know how to go back. How do I go back?
You just did.
Okay. So our legislation that was passed in 2004 during a special session, so those of you that understand how that works legislatively, the governor vetoed the legislation that was originally passed, pulled everybody for a special session, so basically you were all held hostage till we all could agree and walk out of the room that with a program we could actually implement, and a program that met muster legislatively and also for the governor. So we did something very unique. That is the 4th largest state, the state of Florida. No matter how big we are, we only have 67 counties and 67 local school boards. So we all know each other's name, we know where they're located. Now we got mega school districts, Broward, Miami-Dade, Jacksonville, but you know, we are a southern state, a little bit of southern hospitality there. But our legislature created early learning coalitions, and they are basically 501c3s. They have a coalition board. Certain members of those boards, including the chair, are appointed by the governor, but trying to look at a completely different governance structure at the local level that was not the public schools. Remember, public-private, we're not taking over the 4-year-olds. We're not coming in to take every 4-year-old and rip them out of their environment that the families had prior chosen. So that's where we are. We started with actually somewhere around 45. I'm thinking early learning coalitions. I have a former colleague in the audience, Gladys Wilson, who we did this battle together, implementing the state's VPK program. So the other piece I think that is very remarkable for us is not only the early learning coalitions, but when you also look, don't know where I'm supposed to point. Okay, you look at our participation. You know, we do, and I'm sure you all do with state government, when it's a state-funded program, we got all kinds of estimating and economists, and we have all kinds of forms. We look at all kinds of data to project, and it was a really tussle in the beginning years to see where were we going to level off. People were very surprised in the early years that we went from 48 to 57%. Looks like we are leveling off a little, but with a state that a cohort about 200,000 in our grade groups, we're serving over 175,000 kids in our state's voluntary pre-K program to the tune of in excess of $400 million annually, completely funded by general revenue funds. One of the other pieces in our state and in your, when I've heard a lot of information about messaging, in the early years it was very clear. We actually started with a name called Universal Pre-K. Well, that didn't last long in Florida. So we substituted V for voluntary, but just trying to make sure that families and also the business sector understood. What's also very important to us in Florida and elsewhere is that parents have choices. So what we showed you here is a pie chart we show a lot that shows you the diversity of providers. We have some standards for it to be a VPK provider, but it's pretty broad. Our credentials are not certified teachers for the school year program. Parents have two options. I can do a half-time program, which is basically 540 hours, 3 hours a day for the school year program, or I could opt to do a full-time summer. Summer has a little higher standards in that I have to have I'm a credentialed teacher. During the school year, I can have what we call a child development associate plus some additional training. But if you look at public schools aren't huge players in this. Now, we kind of have to put this side by side. When this constitutional amendment passed, it was the exact same year our class size in K-12 constitutional amendment passed. And we were just overflowing at the seams in most of our K-12 schools. So first of all, the public sector didn't have room for 4-year-olds. They were using those classes for K1, 2, and 3. And that may have worked to our advantage. But when we've also run these numbers, this is the total number of providers and by provider type. We've also run just to see if it was consistent. It's also pretty close to where the kids are. So in other words, 17% of our 175,000 kids are in public school programs, because you would kind of wonder if public schools were running much bigger programs than some of the private sector. So that also was a very deliberate choice in Florida too. Also making sure parents have, and we really don't do as good a job as we should, we just need to improve every day about consumer education. There is a statutory requirement. Parents have VPK provider profiles that gives them a lot of information about what that provider does, what is the curriculum that they use, what hours, what other kinds of programs do they participate in. And it also includes something called our VPK kindergarten readiness rate, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. When we think about the structural and governance pieces, those were pretty logistic and pretty mechanical, even though it took a lot of arm twisting and a lot of moving forward to get communities to play. But when we think about the standards and what did we expect to go on in our VPK programs, we had set very high expectations for 4-year-olds and did it probably a little differently than most states. We brought in hand-picked researchers that had done rigorous research on what pre-K children, specifically 4-year-olds, could do. And that's how we crafted our early standards back in 2004, 2005. So what could 4-year-olds do in all of the development domains, but very focused on emergent literacy, early mathematical skills, critical thinking skills. And I will tell you, we continue to this day to get pushback. We're not ignoring the whole kid. However, in the VPK program, we are really trying to look at the emergent literacy skills and, as I call, the pre-academic skills as well. Another big deal in Florida, surprise, was accountability. We were putting, not 400 million way back when, but 400 million now into unknown quantities in the private sector. You could, guess that we might be about student outcomes, which is not a pretty topic even to this day in the early childhood community. Remembering this is one of the last communities that had child expectation and standards. We were wicked and evil in K-12 when we were pushing forward with scientifically based instruction in reading. Heaven forbid we talked about science, technology, engineering, and math, and what you needed to do to get kids ready for kindergarten to kind of do that critical thinking. So our legislature created kindergarten readiness rates. We are a state that has uniformly screened all kindergarten kids for well over 30 years. We've used uniform screening instruments across all 67 districts for about 10 years, meaning the state goes out and procures them. They must be aligned with the VPK standards. And then we basically have all the kids assessed in kindergarten, yes, after VPK, not pre and post pre-VPK. We have one of those measures, but accountability is consistent. It is measured by kindergarten teachers, public and private school administering the assessments within the first 30 days. We calculate a readiness rate, which is very simply what percentage of the kids are ready on both measures. One's very heavy in emergent literacy and early literacy skills. The other one's much more developmental. Accountability has been ratcheted up the last couple of years by our State Board of Education. Used to be your kids didn't have to be ready on both measures, but for the last 2 years, children had to be assessed as ready by that kindergarten teacher on both measures and at least 70%. So some of the outcomes of that is one of our favorite things we like to look at. We talk about VPK completers. Meaning those that attended 70% of the time, because 4-year-olds don't have to be in school and families have lives. Non-completers are any kid who didn't complete 70%, and then VPK kids who did not participate in all. And you can take a look at how that bar has continued to be raised. Is absolutely hands down. Kids who go to VPK 70% or more of the time are more ready than those that don't complete VPK, and certainly far more ready than kids who don't have that VPK experience at all. So that's kind of been one of our ongoing themes, what we are very thrilled about. We know that also, we continue to know that, because we can't give you scientific data, but when you've looked at the remarkable results Florida has made, this was about the same time we were implementing our Reading First grants, and made sure that pre-K wasn't seen as the silver bullet, and we don't believe it is the silver bullet, but it's absolutely an important component of a comprehensive plan in your K-3 programs to get kids ready and to ensure that they are academically and socially and cognitively ready to learn in kindergarten. So, Rayne?
Thank you. Senator Appel.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. Good afternoon. How many of you guys are football fans? Now, she knows that LSU whopped Florida this weekend, but
You didn't tell me he went to LSU before you invited.
this is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a football disaster that befell the state of Louisiana this past Sunday. Right here in Boston, boo.
Oh.
The New Orleans, undefeated New Orleans Saints got swamped in the last 5 seconds by the New England Patriots. Now, you remember I'm humble and I accept the criticism, but here's the point about this. This is a metaphor for where our state has been. I love my state. We could always get the ball to the goal line, but we couldn't get it over. That wasn't what happened Sunday. But that's a good metaphor for where I'm trying to go with this. We had a problem, as most of you guys in most of your states have a problem, in that ball, that goal line, is our educational process, and that's really important. When I was asked to be on this panel, they asked me if I had any props or PowerPoints or anything, and they said, well, you don't really need any of that, so I didn't bring it. But then this morning I said, geez, I need a prop. So in a panic, I asked Rayne, who asked my good LSU friend, Sarah Powell from the staff, to get me a prop. Well, I wanted some little styrofoam balls with some connecting rods and colors and all kinds of cute stuff, and so I got 3 coffee cups and 2 sticks. So let me explain what this is about, and this is really an important point in the history of education in Louisiana. This coffee cup, please use your imagination, represents early childhood education. This coffee cup, K to 12, And this coffee cup, post-secondary, both VOTEC, community college, 4-year, whatever. The problem we have always had in Louisiana, and probably in a lot of states, is that they're not connected. They're just juggling out here in space and bouncing around, and they're advocates for this one and advocates for that one and cash flow streams for this one and so forth and so on. What we have to do, we have to finish this process. We have to get the ball over the goal, is we have to stick these little sticks between these, and I'm not going to be able to do this because I only got 2 hands, and I thought I was getting 3 styrofoam balls. It's good. I'm happy. Anyway, picture the last one. We got to connect these vertically so that they integrate. We have to be able to have a complete structural integration like a good business model for education top to bottom, starting with early childhood all the way through graduate school. So that, you all hear the conversation about Common Core and all that, and then college readiness, that's extremely important. That same model has to affect the way we do business in all of our education structures in the state of Louisiana, and I'm sure in y'all's states. So to that end, let me start with a little bit of history on the background. Many of y'all probably realize Louisiana has had ranked near the bottom in educational outcomes for as long as records were ever kept. In 1997, we embarked upon some reform, very minor, and we basically started setting bars for where kids should be. But by 2010, we hadn't moved, frankly. We just hadn't moved. The story was the same as in many states. Our children were not ready for kindergarten or first grade. The economic impact on them was a disaster. Poverty, the usual problems of society. Graduation rates for high school, 72%. Too many graduates not prepared to enter college, even community college. 37% of high school graduates entering college require remedial, typical symptoms of an unsuccessful system. That was 2010. In 2010, we undertook 2 big reforms, one of which we stole from Florida. Thank you very much. And that was we went to the ABC letter grading process. Huge. I can't tell you what a fight that was politically to get through, but it was highly successful. And, it's amazing that the doomday sayers, rather, that spoke in 2010 have just kind of disappeared. It's just now part of the landscape. Nobody even remembers that we used to have this convoluted system of stars and bells and little arrows and stuff that nobody could understand, and they couldn't understand it because it was designed not to be understood by the status quo folks, as you talked about. Also in 2010, we were one of the very first states to jump on the Common Core and PARC bandwagon, and we continue to be deeply committed to that, even though it's a civil war, quite frankly. I'm sure it is in Florida. I know it is in our state. The real victories came in 2012. We set about to establish a 3-point restructuring of education, mostly K-12 at this time, but also early childhood, that was based on 3 points. Number 1, accountability. We established teacher evaluations and linked that to tenure and to bonuses and the ability to dismiss teachers who, for 2 consecutive years, rated ineffective. For schools, we established school performance scores and established a process under which schools would be sent to what we call the recovery school district, which is basically we're taking them away from school boards and putting them into a state recovery district that has different rigor if they continue to fail. And finally, for districts, one of the biggest problems we ever had, and I'm sure it's the same in most states, was micromanagement of the school operational process by school boards, the political guys. We basically structured it and said that school boards have limited responsibilities. Their responsibilities consist of basically establishing the program of work that they want to see accomplished and the goals they want to see accomplished, raising funds, and one more job, hiring a superintendent and letting that superintendent run the show. There are actually penalties if they micromanage that superintendent. So the superintendent becomes the chief operating officer and has, under our state law, is fully empowered to operate the district. The second major element was parental choice. You hear a lot about that. We enhanced our charter school system, and we created something we call scholarships. It's been in the news a lot. We have about 7,500 kids, poverty-stricken kids, that have been allowed to go to really a school of their choice based on a voucher, which we call scholarships. It's been challenged by the Department of Justice on some rather trivial grounds. Who knows where it's going to come? If you ask the parents of the children that have gotten those scholarships, they just love it. This is the best thing that ever happened to them. The real downside of it is we only have about 7,500. It probably will never grow to a giant program if it's successfully defended in the courts, because there just aren't that many slots in private or parochial schools to take these kids. But we do have that, and it's an important element. The last piece is enhanced academic achievement, and as I mentioned to you all, we jumped on full force with Common Core and PARC. We anticipate going forward with that. PARC goes into effect in Louisiana next year. Is it next year? 2014, 15, yeah, next year. And we recognize the only way for our kids to compete in the 21st century is to increase academic rigor and student performance. The last part, and this is the main reason we're here today, is the early childhood part. A key part of our overall reform effort was the creation of something we call the Early Childhood Education Network. We created this in 2012 along with the other reforms. It's designed to manage and oversee the publicly funded programs that provide early childhood education services. Early development and academic success will drive the overall reform effort to the highest levels attainable. Although some feel that education reform should start at early childhood and then proceed to higher grades, we didn't feel we could afford to wait. I mean, you heard those business professionals in there talking about the implementation of Common Core, and it was best just to bite the bullet and go full blown. So we passed our K-12 reforms and our early childhood reforms contemporaneously, and we put them into place. We have had traditionally a very fragmented system of early childhood. It was cobbled together over many years with all kinds of money streams that nobody could quite get their arms around. So one of our overall goals is to put all that back into the realms of reasons, to weave all the money streams into those that we can apply in the most effective ways. The single goal that we have in early childhood is very simple. We have currently about 54% of our kids ready to enter kindergarten. We want 100% of them ready to enter kindergarten. That's our goal. It's as simple as can be. And remember, I'm not a teaching professional as she is. I'm just a policy guy. And to me, these simple types of policies are the most impactful because I've heard it throughout this conference that you've got to sell this to the moms, the dads, the citizens of your state. And when you explain to them that your goal is 100% kindergarten readiness, they get that. When you tell them that a school is rated A or B or D, they get that. So that's our goal, is to get kids ready for kindergarten. In 2012, we passed what we call Act 3. It required our Board of Elementary and Secondary Education to establish performance targets for children under the age of 3, academic standards for kindergarten readiness for 3 and 4-year-olds, and to create a uniform assessment and accountability system which includes letter grades. We also required that the Board of BESI, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, identify those many disparate funding streams, because we spend millions and millions in early childhood, but it's very difficult to say from whence it comes and where it goes, and to show any connection between spending and getting kids ready for kindergarten. We also required BESI to coordinate with the Department of Children and Family Services, which is a parallel agency, and the Department of Health and Hospitals to align the child care facility licensing standards. This is huge. Ms. Goff touched on that a bit when she was talking about Florida. If we can get this done, we will have gone a major step in the direction of accountability and getting those kids ready. We set up what we call the Louisiana Quality Start Child Care Rating System, which will end up back with the letter grades, as we mentioned. At the present time, we've rolled the early childhood portion out in 13 pilot programs, which represent about 15 school districts. The intent is to increase that by about another 10 next year and then go statewide the following year. The Department of Education will use the knowledge gained from these pilot districts as the basis for that full implementation. Accountability. Plans are underway to transition from what we call the Quality Star Rating System. That's another one of those with bells and whistles and little arrows and rockets and all kinds of cute stuff, into a simple accountability system that parents and everyone can understand, and using, again, the letter grade. Now, we haven't implemented that yet. It's still a work in process. Once this accountability system is developed and implemented, each publicly funded, remember, I'm only talking about those that receive public funds, because we have a lot of other child care facilities that are not publicly funded. Let me touch on that for a second. We anticipate, even though we don't have direct control over those private facilities, that number one, either by peer group pressure or by some form of control over licensure, they will desire to increase their performance and want to increase their performance. We can't force them to do that. We can only entice them to do that. And we haven't had any opposition. Matter of fact, we have a coalition working of the private providers, the public providers, civic folks, and everyone else working together. So this is a cooperative effort. And so far, knock on wood, in Louisiana, we have not seen any rejection of this concept. But from a state perspective, we can't force quality on the private folks, but we anticipate that we won't have any trouble getting their cooperation. And then the key of the accountability system, and then I'm going to end with this, is that it will eventually impact the education program or child care centers' eligibility to continue to receive public funding. And of course, it ties to their ability to get a license or to lose a license. So we intend, once this system's in place in the next 2 years, that it have teeth, because it does us no good to have a voluntary system. We've had a voluntary system, and it doesn't work. That pretty much concludes my general presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, I get to go first with the questions. So we have another elected official. I don't see her here. We have a wonderful representative, Shan, who actually said this is your only time you'll be able to pummel the senator with questions, so make sure you take advantage of that. I'm going to ask a few questions that are a little bit maybe provocative, and just to kind of get some of the energies flowing, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So the first one, so we did a prep call for this panel, and it came up on the call, Shan, that Louisiana was thinking about, the Department of Education was actually thinking of taking over the licensing of early childhood providers. And I think she said, oh my God, why would you ever do that? Was the response. So I'd like for you to react to the idea that the licensing itself would shift from the Family of Health and Human Services to the Department of Education itself.
And that's not proposed in Florida. Just want to make that very clear. Remembering we are a large state, child care facilities, most of them are licensed and have an option. We also have religious exempt, public schools are exempt from licensure, some faith-based programs, and non-public schools. Their oversight is about over 12,000 providers. They are the enforcers. I think I learned at the legislative session at a committee meeting last week, they have like 300 standards. And you think that's like a lot, but we need to remember we're talking about children from infants to 5 years old, an entire day. What do you need to make sure that that child is healthy and safe, and all the interactions with the caregiver? They do enforcement. As I mentioned, they visit all those facilities that are licensed 3 times a year. There's penalties. There's now fines. We didn't have authority, I don't think, in Florida to do fines for a while. But I think the piece is that it's clearly a regulatory function. which when we designed VPK way back when, we were trying to be very strategic, and the legislators were, about looking at the three agencies, and it was three agencies at that time. The Agency for Workforce Innovation, which did regular subsidized child care, school readiness. Department of Education, we were all about standards, teaching and learning, and accountability. And then we had child care licensing in a third agency. And they've crafted our legislation so that each agency's mission was consistent. We have things that, I'm sure you've never heard this, Senator, mission creep, that DCF needs to do what they do, DOE needs to do what they do, which is about setting standards, providing professional development, accountability, and then workforce. What I do need to say is, in our last legislation, they still weren't quite what to do with early childhood programs, but have now, in our 2013 session, through a lot of reform, we are now firmly part of the Department of Education and have the Office of Early Learning. But actually, my comment when you said that is, I've been directed by former commissioners, when they talk about licensing, run. Run, Shan. Don't let them catch you. So, yes.
And it is an interesting point, and I think it highlights the next question I actually want to ask both of you. I mean, the Department of Education is taking this on partly because one of the things that they want to be able to do a better job of is looking at what does it mean to be a high quality pre-K program from the academic standpoint, right? So it is a unique thing to take on the licensing, but it is to push this issue. So I would ask both of you, in your opinion, what components really are important in what you would consider to be a high quality pre-K program? And once that information, for instance, the letter grades or other things are out, what do you hope would change in the public with that information?
Well, if you go back to my analogy of the 3 coffee cups, it's so critical that those kids be ready to move on to kindergarten and the rest of their academic career. So top priority is that those kids are, in our state, those kids will be kindergarten ready. Other priorities are also there too. I mean, we have to be sure that the health and welfare of the children, and this gets to the licensure. I mean, this is a minefield, frankly, and we recognize that, and this is subject to change. It's a work in process. But certainly, I think from our perspective, from a policymaker's perspective, it's that we're spending a lot of the taxpayers' money. We have the future of these children in our hands, and therefore we cannot afford to continue doing business as usual. So it becomes, for us policymakers, are they ready to move on, and will they have a reasonable expectation of success in their latter years of their educational career?
Thank you.
I'd agree with a lot of all of what the senator said, and also from an instructional perspective, it was all about standards. What are the expectations for these children, knowing that what are they expected to accomplish in K-12, whatever standards you're working on, but they are rigorous so kids can have a trajectory of success that we took very seriously and took time, that our standards for 4-year-olds, which are the state standards for 4-year-olds, so it doesn't matter if you're in a pre-K program for kids with disabilities, Title I, we found that across the state, the private sector, by choice, they're using our standards for their instruction, even though they take no government money, but that they were rigorous standards that were clearly aligned to our expectations for kids in K-3, all couched within developmentally appropriate practices, or else we'd, all get run out of town.
Right. So this will be the last question, and we'll actually open it up to the audience. So we know that letter grades for K-12, both states, you've gone through that. You have some battle scars from that, and have been some of the first states to actually do creative interventions as a result of those scores. So do you anticipate moving in this direction for the early childhood system to be as difficult, as complicated, and for organizations that are working to help you all as administrators and policymakers, are there things that we as organizations that work with the general public can do to make that process better and easier?
Well, there's several points I'd like to make. We are, as I mentioned, we're in the middle of deep discussions about Common Core. And one of the deep concerns that the opponents to Common Core raise constantly is governmental intervention, data collection, and so forth and so on. We've heard a lot from the opponents of Common Core about opposition to letter grades, because they have this feeling that children are, they're just children, leave them alone, don't touch them. So we have that misconception. And I mean, I understand the significance of the deep feeling that parents have for children, don't get me wrong, but there are really important elements of their education that are being sacrificed to that. So we have to get over that issue. Then there's the issue of those private providers, the providers that accept public funds, because there are implications in our plan to letter grades. And the implications are as deep as loss of licenses, as deep as loss of funding, once they're in place. We don't have that in place yet. And that's why we're being extremely careful to work in collaboration from all these disparate elements of the early childhood education community. We've got them all at the table, and we're all working together, and we're all addressing their concerns, so that when we finally do roll it out in a couple of years with implications, everybody understands the rules of the game, everybody's had input into the rules of the game, and everybody understands the goal.
Right. And that is different than the K-12 side, so that
K-12,
hopefully
we
would help.
just snapped our fingers and said, we're going to do it next year.
Right.
And there are implications, there are big implications in Louisiana, such as schools that could potentially be lost from a district over to the recovery school district. Several things, as far as teacher losing tenure and so forth and so on.
Right.
Implications in K-12 to the letter grade program. It's different.
Right. Great, thank you. Oh, please.
Just going to, on the other side of the spectrum, we've not talked about grading our VPK programs. I doubt that we will. What we are continuing to move forward with is our VPK accountability based on readiness rates. And one of the things that shows that the chart that I showed you, that VPK kids do outperform non-VPK completers, but from a provider perspective, we do have an accountability system that if I don't meet the statewide readiness rate, I think we call them now providers on probation, you get 3 consecutive years, which most agree is too long. But then you can make a claim that for a good cause exemption, kind of sort of like 3rd grade, because of some unique factors. But what some of the experience is because it's the kids I have. Is because I have kids who are free and reduced lunch, kids who are English language learners, and that just doesn't cut it in Florida. It's not like our standards really high for kindergarten readiness when we really look at who those assessments are. And in the last couple of years, in fact, in last year in 11-12, 38%, remember I said we just ratcheted up, the state board did 2 years ago, 38% of the VPK providers were on probation because they did not have 70% or more of those kids ready. And that same year, over 200 providers were no longer eligible to offer VPK. We had a lot more teeth put in our legislation during the year that if you haven't met the readiness rate for 3 years, you're not granted a good cause exemption, you are done with VPK in the state of Florida for no less than 5 years. So it was clearly putting a line in the sand saying you had 4 cohorts of kids who are now in 3rd and 4th grade, and if you can't meet that measure, then we're not going to contract with you to provide the services.
Great. You can obviously see the Southern hospitality in both of these guys in their answers. It's always done with a smile, though, right? All right, so with that, we're actually going to open it up to you all to ask any questions that you have. We have 2 microphones here, and so I would just ask that you go up to one and be cordial, take turns, and ask your questions.
Hi, thank you. Is this on? Bryce Wiggins, senator in Mississippi, and actually this past session was the lead author on our pre-K bill, along with Senator Tolleson, who's on the panel out there. And we fought many of the battles that y'all talked to. So I maybe want to add something, but also get your take. What we did was actually a collaborative but a matching program. We couldn't afford to fund on a state appropriation, so the the state said we would do a 1-to-1 match, and if it's a voluntary, just like Florida, and also provided tax credits for people to donate, and they would get a tax credit to go to that. But our biggest fight came from the child care providers. And so they've threatened, and so we've entered into implementation right now. They've threatened to derail implementation, and it's voluntary. And I will say it's a small percentage. But part of the law also is that we required really two things: research-based curriculum, and our biggest fight was over the license QRI, what we called QRIS, which we put it to a national-based curriculum. And I had in mind that we needed to put it all under the Department of Ed going forward, but then I heard what you said, so now I'm like, oh my gosh. But so my question is, how do you get them to work with you, so to speak? And then second, have you had experience with the research-based curriculum? We worked with NEAR, National Institute of Early Education. They gave us the 10 benchmarks and said that, you know, it meets all the highest benchmarks. And we have said, you know, you don't have to participate, but if you're going to get state funds, then you have to meet these benchmarks. So have you had experience with that? And I'm interested to hear. Thank you.
Good luck with all of it together. And yes, and we were watching you in Mississippi. I think I was at Florida Center for Reading Research, and we worked with the foundation as well on some of those initiatives. We took a little different tact, as you wouldn't be surprised, in trying to tell our private sector we weren't going to get in your business. We were not going to over-engineer the program, but we were going to hold you accountable for outcomes. So, for example, part of their contract, a VPK provider, majority of them are private, have to say their curriculum is aligned with the VPK standards, and we let that ride. However, when you become a provider on probation, we believe that that's evidence that maybe your curriculum isn't aligned, and then you must select from a state-adopted list. You can use your VPK dollars to pay for it. We don't care, but the state is not adding any more money to pay for it. So we try to respectfully give providers flexibility up front, that you didn't get, you know, we didn't widget you until there was some level of evidence that you could not do that. One of the lessons learned in when I did VPK and DOE in this position here is never underestimate the intensity of one individual representing the private child care industry. I mean, you may think it's the squeaky wheel, they represent only the small group of faith-based, you have no idea. It's even more, to me it was more intent even than the voucher war in K-12, because it's just, we're talking about kids. I mean, you know, they're young. Yes, babies, you're exactly right. So, we'd be glad to help however we could.
Just real quick, we phased it in. Oh, I don't know how fast you're trying to implement. Ours is phased in over multi-years, and we have had a really big effort to reach out and bring all the folks that are involved. Remember, I'm mostly dealing with publicly funded providers, but everybody's at the table, so that we are specifically trying to make them feel part of the process. We're probably going to have the same kind of problems, 1, 2, who knows, 10, I don't know, that are going to be problems. But we'll have to face those when we go. But we're trying to do it a little at a time so everybody has a chance to. And remember, it's also a work in process. So if we find something that's not working in the way we anticipate it, we can change it, as I'm sure you can too.
Let's go to the side.
Yes, I'm Jacqueline Sly from South Dakota, and we do not have anything with pre-K currently. So my question is, a couple years ago, there was an effort to have a pre-K put in place, but one of the issues with faith-based was that they said that public dollars, tax dollars, could not be used, and they could remain a faith-based pre-K. And I have some questions about that, of how it happened in Florida, because we were told that they would have to take down anything that had to do with the faith-based pre-K, and a lot of parents, there was an outcry because they wanted their children to go to that. Could you address that, please?
Sure, and that may go back to one of my first comments, is it's a constitutional amendment in Florida that makes it very clear we are not part of the elementary and secondary programs. So a lot of those other requirements, we have some level of prohibitions about who you can give money to, but that was clearly never implemented or applicable to VPK. We were also very clear too, you know, we didn't care what your curriculum taught and what the theme was and the story was about, as long as it was aligned with the standards and developmentally appropriate, and have pushed very hard to try and get a faith-based curriculum on the approved list for providers on probation. But that was not an issue ever in our state, and I think it's because of the way the constitutional amendment was written.
Sir, on this side. Mm-hmm.
Ziley, Treasurer of the State Board of Education in Michigan. My concern is with some of the rhetoric that seems self-serving to me. I've read some of these studies that claim every dollar invested in preschool education will get $7 back, and the assumptions are flimsy. I'd like to know, where is all the investment we got from investing in Head Start? I further think that if a parent gives up a minimum wage job and is investing $400 a week, equivalent of time and attention in his or her children, this is a much greater social investment than the per pupil spending, I think, in any state on preschool education. So the rhetoric distorts the issue, and I think loses credibility with some of us who try to read between the lines. And my question is this, and I guess it's for you, Shan. I am prepared to believe that the VPK program in Florida is an improvement over Head Start. And could you explain what are the factors that make the VPK in Florida effective, whereas Head Start has been a colossal failure but still gets more money every year? Thank you.
That was an easy question, wasn't it? One of the pieces I'll be very upfront to say is there are a lot of critics of Florida's VPK program, very specifically because we chose not to over-engineer the program. We were looking at a voluntary program in a very large state, and we also, there is a bottom line. To serve 80% of our kids, it's in excess of $400 million. The dollars are not huge for the 3-hour-a-day part-time program. Our base student allocation is under $2,400. So you're not going to buy a bachelor's level or certified teacher with that for a 3-hour day without putting together a lot of other fund sources. So we tried to go simple. I think one of the pieces that we all get frustrated, depending upon where you are in the sector, about the research that comes out. I mean, there are criticisms about every quote-unquote kind of soft research study and those that are rigorous. And it's hard to do rigorous because, like in Florida, you are not going to randomly assign a 4-year-old to a program. So it's like some of our rigor is already doomed before we start. I think for most programs, typically a finding is that the cognitive effects of a pre-K program are not sustained for a very long time. I mean, it's the soft pieces, but yet we have anecdotal and we have done the matching. We have the longitudinal database. We do have information that shows the kids that went to VPK do better on the 3rd grade Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test. We followed at least 2, if not 3 cohorts. Can we unequivocally say VPK was the reason? No. I do think what's most, as you mentioned, the social impact is that you are hearing lots more from economists and even Nobel laureates about that there is a social benefit long term, and you typically see greater educational attainment when the kid's 14, you see less incarceration in juvenile justice, you see higher wages, but it's a long time after. And again, can you 100%, most hardcore researchers say this program is the reason why? No.
And it might be, too, a good to bring back the point that the senator made earlier, which is, you can't just have pre-K reform alone, right? I mean, if you have the pre-K reform and then you don't have the K-12 reforms that continue that cognitive learning well along the way, then there's a big loss there. So, on this side.
My name Riley. I'm from Colorado, and I had two questions. The first for Ms. Goff. I was wondering a little bit about the funding structure. In Colorado, we have the Colorado Preschool Program. We've had it since 1988, and there is some private, some through the school district. We're proposing to expand that, and one of the fears is that because the dollars flow from the state to the school districts and then to private providers, that the school districts will see the increased funding and want to keep the kids, and we really want to maintain that choice. And so just would love to understand that. And then my second question for the senator is around some of the conversation that happened when you guys worked on this policy. In Colorado, early childhood issues tend to actually be pretty partisan, and the major arguments are, this is the job of the parents, or we're not doing a great job with K through 12, so why do we need to stretch ourselves earlier? And I would love your thoughts on how you address that, as I assume it came up.
I can take the funding question first. I think that's one of the basic reasons why our legislature created a completely different structure for funding other than our 67 school districts, because that would have never flown in the private sector or the child care sector. There wasn't, remembering our climate there, we were doing scholarship programs, we were expanding choice. There was not a lot of trust between the public and private sector. So it flows through, the money flows through the early learning coalitions. They have contracts with the 6,000 plus providers, and the dollars flow through them. Public, private, doesn't matter. You get the same amount per kid.
When we passed the legislation that enabled the early childhood program in Louisiana, it passed the House and the Senate unanimously. We had no opposition. The governor signed it, no problem. Now, since then, in conjunction with the discussions on Common Core, we've heard some of those arguments, and they're almost, I don't want to say petty, because that's not a very good word, but they're almost selfish in some cases. It's like, well, we know what's best for our children, and that's true, but where have you been? It's not like we're not looking to take this on. We want the parents involved. We've had more parent involvement since the Common Core controversy heated up in the last 2 months than in my entire legislative career. And it's the same sort of thing with early childhood. It's not as intense, though. We're not hearing it. We're hearing some of that from the folks who are interested in the Common Core issue. The problem we've had is that we've had a very dysfunctional system in the state. And whether it's from the private providers or the public providers, everyone wants to succeed. So they're welcoming the opportunity that we're presenting, and we're guardedly optimistic that we're going to overcome those objections that are legitimate objections in many cases from parents who legitimately believe that their rights are being impinged upon. We don't think so, but we will address those as they come.
Hi, my name's Austin Slaymaker from Oklahoma. So first off, I have a clarification question real quick. So your providers that are your VPK providers, I presume some of them were just traditional child care providers previously and went from grades or from preschool through 5th grade or whatever. And do any of them still have those children in the upper grades where they go to school and then they come to them after school?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We have all kinds of configurations between preschool, non-public school, and public schools.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And some of those kids, based upon their income level, maybe that's being paid for with public dollars. Maybe not state dollars, but federal dollars, likely.
Correct.
Okay. So here's my mission creep question for you.
Okay.
I know it goes beyond pre-K, but those facilities, they're getting public dollars, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not aware. My wife in high school was one of the daycare workers in these places, and predominantly federally funded one. They do not have any sort of requirements to have a reading hour or anything like that. Correct? Am I right
Correct.
there?
Correct.
So here's the heart of my question. In your states, or do you know any states that have adopted policies in which require child care facilities, if they take any sort of public funds, that they have extended learning programs after school if they're going to be accepting public funds? And I'm talking about, first grade through however high they go.
I'm not aware in Florida that we do.
Can't answer.
I guess to follow up with that, then, do you think that would be allowable for a state to require child care providers that take federal monies to require them to have some sort of academic plan that shows that they provide books or reading to the children that they serve?
Good.
I don't think we can. If they just take like Head Start funds, for instance,
Yes.
I don't think we have that authority. They could voluntarily do it. I don't think we have that authority, unless it's commingled with federal funds that flow through the state, unlike Head Start funds. Then possibly yes.
I remember you from the teacher prep session, so I know you have a good question.
Thank you. I'm Senator Howard Stevenson from Utah, chair of the Education Appropriations Committee. About 8 years ago, Utah was invited with the then 11 states that did not have state-funded pre-K programs to Big Sky, Montana by the Pew Charitable Trusts as teams to develop a plan for rolling out pre-K programs in their states. At that time, our team realized that we spend less per student than any state in the nation, and that to add a 14th grade to the K-12 system would be like adding water to the soup, and we didn't see how we could do it. So we developed a plan for putting in-home software for these pre-K kids. And we had legislation that went out for an RFP to see who had the best software. Waterford was chosen with their Upstart program, and they put the computers in the homes of these low-income families, and if families already had computers, they just put the software on there. Yeah. And it cost, rather than costing $6,500 to $8,000 per child, it cost $1,500 for the pilot, and if they were to scale it statewide, it would be about $700 per student, a real bargain. But the question is, what were the results? Part of the legislation required there to be a third-party evaluation, and so the State Department of Ed contracted with a third-party evaluator, and in the third year, which we just released the data for from the third-party evaluator, they evaluated the students with the Bader and Brigant's early intervention, early phonemic awareness, and that kind of stuff. You know that those evaluations better than I do. But on the Brigant's evaluation, the Upstart children outperformed the control group double the reading the growth, and with the Bader, they tripled the growth. We were hoping for maybe a 15-20% bump, and that would be certainly worth the funds. It's really quite stunning to see that. And for 20 minutes a day in the home, the first week the kids aren't very active on it, but after that, the first thing they say is, "Mom, can I go with Rusty and Rosie?" because it's so joyful for them. Have you looked at those kinds of lower cost deliveries to get kids ready for this? Some of these kids are entering kindergarten reading, even though they come from, and these teachers are now saying, "Were you part of the Upstart program?" And they're starting to notice that these kids are really quite remarkable in how they're starting kindergarten.
It is really cool when kindergarten teachers share with you or principals, I can look in a room, interact with kids, and I know who participated in VPK. I mean, it's almost like that's face validity as well. I would tell you with Waterford Early Learning that some of our preschool programs do in fact use those, typically some public schools because they're using it also in their K-3 programs. In Florida, again, we were unique because it was a citizen-led constitutional amendment. So it was fairly prescriptive that they were talking about high-quality early learning opportunities in public and private sector. But that's amazing to know that you got those kind of outcomes.
I actually have two questions. Is there a problem with where both parents work, or if there's only one parent, the parent works, so the child wouldn't be able to avail themselves of that type of a program, number one? And number two, is there any issues with like socialization issues, whereas a child's in a pre-K program, they're with other children? Is there a problem that they're not getting exposed to other children? I'm just curious.
It's whatever the parents have chosen for them for that daycare or for those activities, but this is in addition to that. So they find those 20 minutes during the day sometime in order to keep the computer in the home. And the benefit it also gives that single mom, for example, who's never had internet connection, is it connects her to her employment, to the rest of the community, and in so many ways where that single mom or that low-income family finally has this opportunity. The siblings also have free access to upper-level kinds of programs on there at no cost, because we just want them to have as much exposure to academic prowess as possible.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Is there anybody else with any questions? All right, well, thank you. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Been great.